Okay, good. All right, so the title of this talk is Immigration Restrictions, a Solution in Search of a Problem. Immigration restrictions are the kind of thing where people know they want them, they just aren't sure quite why. There's got to be a good reason. This is not, sorry, this is, let's see, how about this? Is that good? No.
That did it.
Okay, so I have to go backwards. Okay. Okay. So let me just begin with a thought experiment. So suppose that moved by the plight of the Haitians after the earthquake, you decide to take a trip down there to work on a relief mission. You work there for 2 weeks, you are ready to go home, but when you arrive at the airport, you are told by the people at the airport that you are not cleared to return to the United States. And you say, why? And they say, well, I don't know why. You can go over to the American Embassy. And at the American Embassy, when you ask why you're not allowed to go back to the United States, they tell you, we don't have to give you a reason. We don't have to give you a reason. The United States does not have to explain itself to you. We're just doing this. Now, almost everyone would think that this is a great injustice. You know, there are some perfectly good reasons they might give you. They might say, well, we think you're a murderer and we don't want you in our country. We're scared of you. You could try that. They may say, you're a thief, you're a convicted criminal. Again, we consider you a menace to society. We don't want to have you around. Right? But you can say, none of these are true. And they can say, well, what's so bad about living in Haiti? What's the big deal? You may say, well, have you looked around? It's terrible here. People are dying in the streets. People are eating dirt. There's horrible suffering here, and I would rather go someplace else. Right? I don't want to stay here. It's just scary here. The life here has some very severe downsides. Right? So poverty, actual death, people literally eating dirt, right? Not made up, literally true. Oppression, and then something that is more that is not as pressing, but still serious, just isolation. Right? In Haiti, most of the people that you want to talk to and hang out with aren't there. Right? You want to go someplace else where the people that you want to talk to and be with are present. Okay. Now, the point of this thought experiment isn't to show that immigration restrictions are absolutely wrong no matter what. The point is just to show that there's a presumption against them. Telling someone that they are not allowed to leave Haiti or some other third world country is something that requires a reason. Right? To just say, I'm doing it and I don't need to explain myself to you is not fair. It's not right. Maybe there is a good reason, but at minimum, it is incumbent upon the person who is imposing the restriction to have some decent argument about why this is so. All right, so it doesn't prove that immigration restrictions are wrong. There are a lot of things that seem wrong on the surface that actually turn out to be morally justified. So just consider someone who says, look, here's what we're going to do. We're going to take this sharp knife. We're going to slice you open. We're going to remove an organ. And we're going to, and by the way, before we do this, we're going to ether you. So step one, we're going to knock you out. We're going to slice you open, we're going to move an organ, and that's our plan. Normally, this would be very wrong to do this to a person, to knock them out, to go and cut them open, remove an organ. But if actually there is a medical necessity for it, if they are greatly extending the length of your life by doing this, that's a pretty good reason to do it. Also, if they have your consent, pretty good reason. Furthermore, also important that there isn't any cheaper or easier way of doing the same thing. Right? If there's a doctor who operates on you and saves your life, but you later find out that he could have given you a pill that would have accomplished the same thing, you can quite reasonably say, wait a second, why did you cut me up? And you say, well, you're so ungrateful, I saved your life. Yes, but you could have saved my life by giving me a pill. You didn't have to knock me out and cut me open and take out an organ. Why couldn't you have done it that way? Right? So again, to go and cut someone open in this way would require not merely an argument in its favor, but also the additional claim there isn't any cheaper or more humane way of going about it. Okay. But the point of this thought experiment about Haiti is to say there is a presumption against immigration restrictions. It's the kind of thing where if you did it for no good reason, it would be wrong. The kind of thing where if you did it for no good reason, it would be wrong. All right, so what I'm going to say in this talk is, first of all, proponents of immigration restrictions have to show that the evils of immigration, whatever they might be, are so strong that they overcome this presumption. Right? Immigration causes so many problems of such severity that actually telling someone that they have to remain in Haiti eating dirt is a morally reasonable solution to the problem. And furthermore, also important, to show that there's no more humane or cheaper way of handling the problem. Just saying that immigration has some problems and this solution solves this immigration restriction solve the problem, therefore immigration restrictions are okay, isn't good enough. If there is some other cheaper and more humane way of handling the very same problems, immigration restrictions remain unjustified. All right, so overcoming the presumption. How could this be done? There have been many attempts, and what I want to do tonight is just go over each of them and think about them step by step. Right? So probably the most popular argument in favor of immigration restrictions is that the point of immigration restrictions is to protect Americans from poverty that would be caused by low-wage competition. Right? So this is in South Parkian terms. They took our jobs. Argument? You don't watch South Park here? You should. Okay. All right, so they took our jobs, so they're here to protect Americans from poverty, which would be caused by low-wage competition. Another argument, which is just a little bit less popular, is that immigration restrictions exist to protect American taxpayers from welfare state exploitation. Saying, look, if immigrants come here, they're going to collect money from the government. We don't want them to do this to us. It's not fair, so we're not going to let them come here and do this to us. Another argument is that immigration restrictions are here to protect American culture. So immigrants are going to come here and ruin the culture that we have, and in order to protect our culture, we need to keep them out. And a last argument that I'm going to talk about is that immigration restrictions are here to protect American liberty. So the fear here is that immigrants come from countries where they do not enjoy a lot of freedom. The reason why they don't have this freedom is possibly because the people there don't want to have more freedom, don't want to have the kinds of freedom that we have, and if we let them in here, they are going to turn our country into their country, and then we'll have to go and find another country to live in. Okay, so just starting out, protecting Americans from poverty. Just to begin, there are some very good reasons to think that this is a severe problem, because if you know anything about the world, there is severe poverty among many countries with tons of people on Earth. So roughly speaking, there are about 1 billion people who survive on $1 a day or less on Earth right now, right, which is about triple the population of the United States. Okay, so there's about 1 billion people who are somehow managing to survive on $1 a day or less, right, and they would love to move here. Right? They would think that doing the worst job here that Americans think is terrible is a fantastic job. Right? A job like picking cucumbers, where Americans will do it for a little while and say, oh my God, this is the most horrible thing I've ever done in my life. Someone from Haiti who is used to eating dirt would have a very different perspective. Right? So they would love to come here and move here in large numbers. And then, since you've been, let's see, most of you are in an economics class of some kind, right? So, if there is an enormous increase in the supply of something, what would you typically expect would happen to the price? It would go down, right? And what do we call the price of labor? We just call it the wage, right? So the concern is that if immigrants were allowed to come here, they would move here in large numbers because conditions here are so much better than what over 1 billion people are used to. And if they did, this would drastically increase the supply of labor and drastically reduce wages, right? So far this seems like a pretty good story. However, it turns out the story, for all of its superficial appeal, has a lot of really big holes. The most important one is this. Low-skilled wages are indeed likely to fall, right? But most Americans are not low-skilled. Right? So if you go and think about what the typical Haitian is likely to be doing if he comes to the United States, is he likely to be competing with you guys? Probably not. All right? So many people in Haiti are illiterate. They've only done very simple menial jobs. Those are the kinds of jobs they're likely to get if they come here. Right? So it is not the case they're going to be competing with Americans of all levels of skill. And in fact, you may say, well, so American college graduates don't have much to worry about them. What about American high school graduates? Even American high school graduates are extremely skilled relative to the bottom billion on Earth. Right? So you have to remember that, like, out of the bottom billion, very large percentage are illiterate. Many of them know very little other than farming. So this is what you can see if you go take a look at what is life like in countries with a lot of very poor people. So look at Pakistan or Bangladesh, right? Or look at much of Africa, right? So you have people who are, by American standards, very low skilled. Even American high school graduates, who you might think of as not really knowing very much, know a lot in comparison, right? And of course, American workers have many other skills that immigrants are less likely to have. Just familiarity with American culture, familiarity with modern technology. And finally, a really big one is just being able to speak English. Right? Being able to speak English is another important job. So rather than thinking about there being one market for labor, it makes a lot more sense to think about there being many different markets for different kinds of labor at different skill levels, and realizing that most of the immigrants who would come here are likely to be entering into low-skilled jobs, which are not the kinds of jobs that most Americans are going to be doing. Right? Now, this also means something that is even better if you are a worker who has more skill, which is that not only are you not likely to be competing with the immigrants, you are likely to be their customers. They are making the stuff that you buy cheaper, right? And not just college students, but also high school students, high school graduates, and even many people who have not finished college are actually going to be people who are buying the products that immigrants make rather than competing with them directly in the labor market. All right, now furthermore, there's been a lot of work to estimate, so how much would, does an increase in immigration even reduce the wages of low-skilled Americans? Okay, so there's a range of research here, so what I want to do to give you an idea about what the range looks like is just to give you the results out of the textbook of the most respected critic of immigration in the entire economics profession, George Borjas at Harvard, who has spent most of his career attacking immigration and how awful it is. Right? So you can go and open up his own textbook and find his own estimates for how much harm immigrants have done even to the lowest skilled Americans, right? So even to American high school dropouts. And here's what you can find in his own textbook. He estimates that the total effect of the last 20 years worth of immigration on the wages of American high school dropouts has been reduced wages by about 4.8%. Not 48%, not 4.8% per year, 4.8% for a total of 2 decades. Time when many millions of immigrants came to the United States and found a better life, right? And yet the reduction in the wages, even of Americans that you would think of as closely competing with them, is actually quite small. And again, this is an estimate by someone who is looking for a large estimate. And this is the best that he can come up with. Right? And again, you don't have to take my word for it. You can look in his textbook, very well-selling labor economics textbook, and find his own answer. Okay. All right, now this is a high estimate of how much harm immigration has done to not American workers in general, but just to low-skilled American workers. There are many other estimates that use a different approach that get estimates that are considerably more optimistic than that. Okay, so for example, what Borjas basically does is assume that American high school dropouts are equivalent to high school dropouts who aren't born in this country, right? But there are in fact some clear differences between American high school dropouts and someone with an equivalent education who's born in, say, Bangladesh. Right? The most obvious one is Americans are much more likely to speak fluent English. Right? Now, what some researchers have done is actually taken a look at the kinds of jobs that low-skilled Americans versus low-skilled foreign workers do, and they find, not so surprisingly, that Americans are a lot more likely to specialize in jobs that require English fluency. Right? And foreigners are much more likely to specialize in jobs that don't require much use of English. So, for example, in a typical restaurant, there's one set of jobs where it's important to be able to speak good English, right? Like being the waiters. On the other hand, there's plenty of jobs in the kitchen where it isn't very important that you be able to speak English at all, right? So what has been found is that actually there is the specialization where Americans are in areas where there are a lot of foreigners are much more likely to specialize in jobs that require knowledge of English, and they wind up getting the benefits that the skills that they have are actually being purchased by the immigrants. Right? So basically, you can think about jobs as being a combination of language and non-language skills. And if you see that there's a large increase in the supply of non-language skills, you can avoid much of the harm by specializing more in a different kind of occupation. And actually, you can even profit because when you let in more people who are supplying non-language skills, they're buying products that require both. And you can actually wind up seeing an increase in your wages. So using this approach, high school dropouts still seem to be losing a little bit, but more on the order of 1 or 2% as a result of all the immigration of the last couple of decades. And everyone else in the United States seems to be actually gaining from immigration on average. Okay. Furthermore, wage effects are not the only ways that Americans are affected by immigration. So there's also offsetting benefits for American employers. Right? If you think, well, who cares about them? Well, anyone who owns stocks, anyone who has a pension fund is indirectly an employer. You might not think of yourself as an employer, but you are. If your parents are retired and were living off a pension, they are capitalists. I'm always amazed when my parents, who are both retired, see something on the news about the minimum wage going up, and they get a look on their face like, yay, life for us is getting better. I'm like, when was the last time you ever worked for minimum wage, Dad? Like 1950? And then realize, this is coming out of the pockets of employers and consumers, and that's you. You're capitalists. You may not think of yourselves as capitalists, but that is just what you are. Right? So employers, investors, consumers, and the last one that turns out to be very important is landowners. Okay, so there's been some work done on the effect of immigration on real estate prices, and the punchline is that if immigration increases the population of a city by about 1%, real estate prices seem to rise by about 1%. Okay, so for anyone who owns real estate, this is very good news, right? And of course, almost all real estate in the United States is owned by people of what nationality? Yes, Americans. Now, if you say, well, I rent, I don't own, so this is bad for me. Well, it is true that it's bad for you that prices are going up, but on the other hand, Nowadays, since the government is bailing out so many people with bad mortgages, the benefits of higher real estate prices are actually spread around to all taxpayers, not just people who own homes. Okay. All right, so you can think about what would happen to California real estate prices if every Mexican immigrant went home. The prices are already down by maybe 30%. So if every Mexican immigrant were to go back to Mexico, like what that would actually do to real estate prices in Los Angeles or California in general, if you think things are bad now, they can get a lot worse, and would. All right, so you put all this together, the actual evidence on immigration being bad for Americans economically seems to be very weak. In fact, there are a lot of ways that Americans gain. The overall average benefit for Americans seems to be quite positive. There are some Americans that lose. Right? So if you are a low-skilled worker who doesn't speak English well, who doesn't own your own home, who doesn't pay any taxes, we can find a subset of Americans who are losing as a result of immigration, but that's very different from saying that Americans in general lose. Anyway, more importantly, so even if this complaint were true, so even if you really believe that Americans were greatly suffering as a result of immigration in the labor market, there still is the question of, is there any cheaper and more humane way of dealing with the problem other than saying you have to stay in Haiti and eat dirt? If you just use your imagination, what could we do instead of saying, if you try to come here, we will grab you and throw you back in your own country? Right, now here I'm going to say something a lot of other economists have said, but it's sufficiently weird that most non-economists would never think of it, but it's not so weird. Plenty of economists have thought the very same thing. It's, look, all right, how about this? Instead of telling immigrants you can't come here because you would cause them harm, say, fine, you can, we are allowing you to come here, but you're going to have to do something to compensate us for whatever harm you're doing. Right? So for example, you could charge immigrants an admission fee. So rather than letting coyotes charge $4,000 to smuggle Mexicans illegally into the United States, the US government could be at the border saying there's a $4,000 admission fee. Or how about like a $3,999 admission fee? Right? To just undercut the coyotes. Right? I think actually most Mexican immigrants who are coming illegally would be happy to pay a bit more, because you wouldn't have to worry about being abandoned in the desert by a coyote who takes your money and then forgets about you. Kinds of problems that are commonly experienced. Whereas if you just know, you just pay $4,000 and you can go to the United States to work. So that's one solution, is letting people in with an admission fee. That's one thing you do. Something else that you might try instead is say, look, all right, we're going to let you in, but if you come in, you're going to have to pay higher taxes. So if you want to come here, you can pay. You're going to pay the normal income tax plus an extra 10 percentage points. So if normally you'd be paying 10%, you have to pay 20%. And normally you're paying 35%, you pay 45%. Right, so the idea is that the admission fee or the extra taxes could be tailored to be enough to compensate whatever Americans you think are actually suffering as a result of the immigration. And again, just say, would that work? Well, you have to remember that there is a large increase in the wealth of the world when an immigrant moves here. Right? So, for example, a typical Haitian, if he's earning $1 a day in Haiti, could expect to earn $30 or $40 a day in the United States. Right? And would you think that immigrants would still be willing to come if they paid an extra 10% tax on their extra earnings? They say, well, I could either stay in Haiti and earn $1 a day, or I could go to the U.S. and I'd have to pay 10 extra percentage points of taxes. It's not a difficult decision if you're in Haiti. Right? So it's so from their point of view, it is a way better deal than they're getting. And from our point of view, we could raise the tax considerably and still leave a whole lot of incentive for them to come. Right? So even if the harm they're doing to Americans is far larger than George Borjas has estimated, and again, you think that he'd be coming up with a high estimate because of his overall outlook, it looks like it would be pretty easy to charge immigrants an admission fee, making them far better off without harming ourselves. Okay. So the idea is, charge immigrants some money to come here, use the revenue to compensate native workers. Many different ways you could do that. You could reduce taxes on low-income natives. You could actually pay for job training. Plenty of other ways around it. All right. Another argument. And I notice very often after someone complains that immigrants are coming and taking all of our jobs, then they quickly move on to the argument that immigrants are coming here and they're all going on welfare. Right? So there's some contradiction between the two complaints. Yes, maybe they're working jobs and they're also on welfare. Right? So you could swing that, but still, this is the kind of thing where it makes me wonder, is it really the problems that are bothering you, or is it the immigrants themselves and you're looking for problems? All right, so in any case, the simple story here, which again begins on solid ground. It says if you take a look at how much we pay Americans who don't work and compare this to typical wages in many poor countries, turns out that we pay Americans more not to work than many countries pay you to work full-time. So from the point of view of, say, someone in Haiti or Bangladesh, they could either stay in their home countries and work like dogs, or they could come to the U.S. and go on welfare. It looks like it's a fantastic deal for them to go on welfare. Right? So the concern then is that if immigrants could come here, there'd be a large number who would move here just to go and suck our blood, right? Just to go and not contribute, to draw money from hardworking Americans who are paying taxes and contribute nothing. Okay, so what can we say about this? Well, the biggest problem with this argument is it's based upon a basic misconception about what the American welfare state does. You don't go and take a look at the budget and see how much of our income how much of the federal budget actually goes to the poor. Turns out to be a pretty small amount of money. Where do we actually send the free money to primarily? The elderly. The elderly get far more free money than the poor. Right? Now, when you take a look at the profile of a typical immigrant is actually a healthy young male. Typical immigrant is a healthy young male who is not going to be able to cash in on the really generous programs for many decades. We're going to feel closer. Like if you are not elderly, most of the remaining money is reserved for moms with kids. Right? So, and yet immigrants tend to be healthy young males. So actually, just based upon the way that money is spent, right, and the kinds of people who are easily able to collect, immigrants actually don't fit the profile nearly as well as people think. It is not the case that we are throwing money at poor people in the United States. Rather, we're throwing money at the elderly, with a much smaller amount of money going to the poor, and even there, much of it reserved for women with kids or for the sick, rather than for healthy young males who actually have a pretty hard time getting free money. Okay, so this is just a key fact to realize. Most of the money is actually going to the old, not the poor. New immigrants tend to be young. Right? Now, when you actually go through, so when you begin with this realization, it shouldn't be so surprising that when you look at the actual research on the fiscal effects of immigration, and again, so I realize that you may not believe me, so all I'll say is there are plenty of good broad literature surveys that go over all the research that's ever been done. So, for example, there's a very good piece by the National Bureau of Economic Research, which is posted on my blog. Just a very neutral summary of everything that has actually been found about the fiscal effects of immigration. So the answer is, almost no serious researcher finds a big negative fiscal effect of immigration. There's almost no serious researcher. So what do I mean by serious? I don't mean someone who agrees with me. Right? That's not much of a standard. Now, by serious, I mean someone who has a job at a top 50 university who's able to publish their results in some journal that people at top 50 universities have heard of. Right? So out of that subset of people, there's almost no one has found a big negative fiscal effect of immigration. There is a range. There are some people who find positive effects, saying that immigrants are actually paying more in taxes than they're collecting in benefits. And again, if that is hard to believe, if you go back to the budget and look more closely, you'll also see that there are many items in the budget that have nothing to do with the number of people in the country. So, for example, national defense. If we let in another 10 million people, is there any reason to increase the number of nuclear weapons we have? It's like, well, now that we've let in 10 more million people, we need 3 more nuclear weapons to protect those people from attack. Not really, right? And similarly, like even in terms of like how many people do we need in the army? If we let in 10 million more people, do we really need to increase the size of the army in order to protect those additional people? Not really. Right? So this means that when you let immigrants in, there are areas of government spending like national defense, which is a very big chunk of government spending, where we don't need to spend any more. So if they're paying any taxes at all, they are lightening the burden of everyone else who's already paying taxes. An even clearer case here is the national debt. All right, so the national debt, so you may have seen calculations saying like the average American owes like $200,000 so this comes from just taking the total national debt, dividing it by the population. If you let in another person who pays taxes, that person is lightening your burden, right? Because the national debt is a fixed number of dollars. If we increase the population, this doesn't instantly increase the number of dollars that the U.S. government owes. So this is another area where the amount of money that government is spending really has nothing to do with the population. So we let in more people. This is a way of sharing the burden. Which, of course, by the way, this is why communist countries would shoot people for trying to flee their countries, right? Because they recognize, hey, there's a person who is contributing. Right? There's a person that we're taxing. They have to go and pay for stuff. And if they all leave, how are we going to pay for our army? How are we going to pay for the Red Army if everyone who wants to leave is allowed to leave the Soviet Union? Okay. All right. Now, in any case, so even if this complaint were true, even if immigrants really were a serious fiscal burden on Americans, once again, the question to ask is there any cheaper and more humane way of handling this concern that doesn't involve saying you are not allowed to leave Haiti, you have to stay there eating dirt and watch your children eat dirt? Again, like if you think that I'm exaggerating, this is actual stories of Haitians eating dirt because they're starving. Okay, so even if this complaint were true, there is clearly a cheaper and more humane alternative. How about this? Freely admit immigrants, but make them ineligible for benefits. Look, you can come here, but you cannot collect benefits. There's many different versions of this. You could say you can't collect benefits for 10 years. I have a colleague who says they shouldn't be, not only should they not be able to collect benefits, their children shouldn't be able to collect benefits. None of their descendants should ever be able to collect benefits. And so, I think they'd be happy to take that deal. If you were to go to people in Haiti and say, well, look, here's the deal. You can come to America, you can go and get a job, you don't have to eat dirt anymore, but you're going to have to pay taxes, and neither you nor your children or your children's children forever will ever be able to get a dime of benefits from the U.S. government. Do you think Haitians would say, that doesn't seem fair? Well, they might say it doesn't seem fair, but they'd still come. They'd be happy to come. And who say, have you thought of your children? Yeah, they're thinking of their children very much. They're thinking that it'd be better for their children to not grow up eating dirt. And the fact they wouldn't be able to collect benefits just is not that big of a deal compared to what people in other countries are used to. Right. All right, so you can freely admit them, but make them ineligible for benefits. Again, if you think this is unfair, they will say this does seem unfair. Right? If they're paying all these taxes for benefits, it seems like they should be able to collect eventually. You'd say, look, fine, you can't collect for 10 years, or you can't collect until you paid $100,000 worth of taxes. You can vary the exact terms however you like. But whatever your complaint is, there is a cheaper and more humane way of handling this than saying immigrants can't come at all. And that solution is to say you're allowed to come here, but there are restrictions on when you're able to collect and how much. All right. Yes. Let's see. Why don't I? So I'm saving it for the end. So why don't I save it for the end? I think it's probably work a little better. All right. So next complaint: protecting American culture. Right. So anytime I've ever heard my dad complain, my dad has all these complaints, by the way, and he's very angry about them. My dad even complains that immigrants are to blame for problems that don't even exist, such as the problem of how all the hospitals in Los Angeles have closed. My dad actually said, Bryan, it's because of immigrants that all the hospitals in Los Angeles have closed. Really? There are no hospitals anymore in Los Angeles? Right, so that's his story, and he's sticking to it. All right. Anyway, another thing he complains about, it's just terrible when you have to go and press 1 for English. I don't want to have to press dos for Espanol. I don't want to even have to hear about the option of pressing dos for Espanol. Right? And certainly if it's something in Korean, then he's going to be very upset. All right, so this is another complaint, which is that immigrants are destroying American culture. This begins with the simplest and most straightforward complaint that immigrants are failing to learn English and instead are forcing us to go and learn their languages. But there are many others. Right? So we'll just start off with the easiest ones to measure and see what we can say about them. Right? So the obvious problem with the complaint that immigrants are not learning English is that it is not true. Okay? If you can go to Samuel Huntington, who is one of the main proponents of this cultural complaint about immigration, even he admits that over 90% of second-generation Mexicans speak fluent English. Yes, first-generation Mexicans do not speak fluent English. Right? It's only about 25%. But out of second-generation immigrants, almost all of them speak fluent English. And so basically immigrants are learning English in exactly the same way that they always have. Same way that any of your ancestors did, unless your ancestors came over in the Mayflower, right, or maybe from Ireland, which is the first generation, tries to adjust, learns a bit of the language, but it's pretty hard to learn a new language, especially if you show up when you're an adult. But the kids learn it. Right? It's always happened in the past, and it still happens today. Nothing has really changed. All right, so this specific complaint about failing to learn English just doesn't fit the facts. Now, a deeper problem here. This is one where, you may say that it's a little bit flippant. Right? I admit, yes, it is a little flippant, but still, I can't resist. Right? So, we just take a look at what almost everyone would consider to be the cultural centers of the United States. So of course, California, New York, and Tennessee. Right? So, home of country music. Yeah, you got some good stuff here. But anyway, the areas that almost everyone would consider to be the cultural centers, yes, California and New York are certainly at the top. Places where you've got the movie industry, you've got the television industry, you've got you have operas, you've got all kinds of high culture. Right? So you just go down the list. By almost any measure, these would be the cultural centers, and yet these are the places that have very high immigration. Basically, they are the states. The states that let's see at the top. They are both these are the two states at the top of the list percentage foreign-born in the entire United States. Okay, so you might just say that's coincidence, but you could also go and take a look at states where, again, to be uncharitable, but states we could call the cultural wastelands. States where, again, they may have natural beauty, they may be great in a lot of ways, but you'll almost never hear someone go and say these are the cultural centers of America. It's like the Dakotas. I need to go to North Dakota just to go to the North Dakota Opera. right? Or the North Dakota film industry, right? So North Dakota, South Dakota, Arkansas. Very rarely people say we need to go to Arkansas for the culture. Alabama, Montana, West Virginia. These are states that have very low immigration, very low percentage foreign born. All right, so again, maybe it's a coincidence, right? But I would say, well, this doesn't seem so coincidental. Like certainly there are some ways where it's pretty obvious where, for example, there are a lot of foreign directors and actors who move to these cultural centers. That's something else. Now, if we also think about another measure of culture that, unlike opera, is actually enjoyed by most Americans, but food. Right? So opera, very few opera fans. Yeah, huge opera fan, but I recognize most people do not share my taste. But for food, however, even my dad enjoys Peruvian chicken. Right? Even my dad enjoys Peruvian chicken. When he shows up to visit me in D.C., so, or he says, "Well, can we go to that great chicken place? Oh, the Peruvian chicken place? Yes, that one. Right? All right, the Peruvian chicken place." All right, so here clearly this is a causal effect, clearly because the people who actually open up the restaurants of a given ethnicity are usually immigrants from the ethnicity of the country whose cuisine they're promoting. All right, so if you just take a look at areas of the U.S. where the food prospects are fairly grim, like obvious thing, if only they had some more immigrants here. If only they had some more immigrants here, there'd be a lot more choices, affordable choices, more interesting food, better food. So, at least in that's one kind of culture that it's hard to deny that immigrants actually causally give us. It's no coincidence. All right, now finally, even if the complaint were true, even if it actually were true that immigrants were destroying our culture, once again, there are cheaper and more humane ways of handling it than saying that you have to stay in Haiti and speak French there. All right, so what do you do? Well, if the concern is that they're not speaking English, how about this? How about say you can come here if you pass a test of English fluency? How many people on earth would be willing to learn English if the only thing you had to do to get into the U.S. was pass a test of English fluency? Enormous number of people would be very happy to come here and would work really hard in order to do it. Right? So if that's your concern, there is a pretty, like just saying, like you can come in here if you demonstrate your knowledge of English, pretty easy to do. All right, now many people say, well, it's not just English, it's like knowledge of our entire culture. Like it's the deeper cultural knowledge. Right? And this is the part where I really start to wonder, so what knowledge of American culture do most Americans even have? So would the test be you have to name all 6 friends on the show Friends? You have to know like Ross, Rachel, Chandler. All right, so would it be that test? It could be that. All right, so certainly it's not going to be name 3 operas. Most Americans cannot name 3 operas. Like name 2 of Shakespeare's histories. How many Americans can do this? So like you just imagine like what would even be on this test of cultural literacy? It's like how many points is a touchdown? All right, so you can even imagine this test. When you actually start writing down the kinds of questions that someone would have to know, it seems pretty silly to me, but whatever. All right, fine. Have whatever test you want. Say, look, all you have to do in order to get into the U.S. is pass a test of cultural knowledge showing that you are able to cope with the complexities of American television, athletics, so on. All right, so do that. Okay, so again, this is a cheaper, more humane way of handling the problem. This would ensure that the only people who came here would be able to speak English, would have a knowledge of our culture. Right, so this would seem to handle the problem. All right, now last complaints. This is one that is particularly common among my friends. Okay, the other complaints are common among normal people, but this last complaint is one that is very common among people who favor free markets, among conservatives, among libertarians. It goes this. All right, yeah, sure. Right, the wage argument's wrong. Sure, maybe the welfare argument's wrong. Culture argument, well, maybe. All right, but it's the most popular excuse among libertarians anyway. Say, look, here's the problem. Immigrants come from statist countries. Immigrants come from countries where they don't enjoy the freedoms that Americans take for granted. And the reason why the story goes that why these countries don't have these freedoms is because the people in these countries don't believe in these freedoms. Like the reason why the economic policies in Mexico are less free than the United States is because Mexicans believe in less free policies than we have in the United States. All right, and then the concern is if we let Mexicans in, they will probably continue to have the same views that they had in Mexico, and when they vote, they're going to vote to make our country look like Mexico. And finally, if we let enough of them come in, they will turn our country into Mexico, and we'll be stuck with the policies that they were just trying to get away from. Sometimes people say, well, people come here love our policies. Well, maybe they just love our riches, and they aren't so clear on the connection between the policies we had for the last 200 years and our riches. So maybe that's the story. All right. So now I'm not going to say there's nothing to this story, right? It is the story that concerns me the most. But I will say at minimum the problem is greatly overstated for a few reasons. First of all, non-natives actually have low turnouts, even adjusting for other factors. So immigrants actually rarely vote. Right? Immigrants rarely vote. Now, strangely, this is sometimes used as a further complaint against them, saying not only are they awful in other ways, but they also don't vote. You know, if you're really worried about them voting for bad policies, shouldn't it be better if they don't vote? Right, so anyway, whatever you think about that, the fact is immigrants have low turnout, which means that their actual effect on policy is quite limited. Right? So, for example, estimates for California, even though even though Hispanics are so non-whites are going to be a majority of the state in a couple decades, and yet white voters will remain a majority of the voters for a couple more decades after that. Why? Because of differences in turnout. Okay. So, but anyway, another argument. This is one that's is a little counterintuitive, but when you really think about it, there's a lot to it. Is this: immigrants actually seem to reduce native support for the welfare state. So even if immigrants themselves are supportive of big government, they also make natives less supportive. Right, so what's going on here? Well, if you go and take a look at the countries on Earth that historically have had the really big welfare states, you can go to Scandinavia. Right, so go to Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Finland. Right now, until about 20 years ago, these countries were pretty much 100% blonde and blue-eyed. Right, so in Denmark, everyone in Denmark looked Danish. Everyone in Sweden looked Swedish, as we would think of it. Right, and in countries like this, it is very common, in fact, standard for them to have big welfare states, and they're happy about it. Right? Because in countries like this, they don't complain so much about the welfare state because, for Danes, you say, well, look, surely Danes would not abuse the system. Right? If you're Danish, you would, the only reason why you go on welfare in Denmark is because you really need to use the system. Right? And in countries, so in ethnically homogeneous countries, you actually tend to see the largest size of the welfare state because people are most comfortable with redistribution if it's going to people who look like them. On the other hand, countries where there's a lot of ethnic diversity are countries where there's generally popular resistance to having a large welfare state because people don't like the idea of the money going to people who don't belong to their group. A very common story about why the United States has a smaller welfare state than Europe is just ethnic diversity. Yes, there are a lot of Americans who don't like the welfare state because they feel the money is going to blacks. Right now, whatever you think about this, there seems to be a lot of truth to the story. So, for example, you can go and take a look at welfare payments by U.S. state. The states in the United States that have the largest welfare payments are the ones where almost the entire population is white. On the other hand, the states where you have the lowest welfare payments are states in the Deep South that have very large black populations. Right? So the story fits. Right? In countries where you've got one ethnicity, everyone belongs to it, you generally have large welfare states because people are very comfortable voting for money to help people look like them. A lot of it is they just trust people who look like them. Surely someone who's Swedish would not rip off another Swede. Right. So whereas in countries that have more ethnic diversity, then there's always a sense of, well, people in that other group don't really need the money. They're just being lazy, they're ripping us off, they're taking advantage of us. Right, so that's the sense. Right, now, whether this concern is true or false, it's still seen either way. It doesn't, from what I'm saying, it doesn't particularly matter. All it's saying is that when you let in more immigrants, you undermine native support for the welfare state. It means that natives are more likely to vote against it because they think that they are getting ripped off. They don't like the idea the money is going to foreigners, which means that they're less supportive of paying for it in general. So the net effect, what is the net effect of letting in more immigrants? It seems very plausible that the actual net effect is to make government smaller rather than bigger. Of course, now if you like big government, you could add this to your list of complaints about immigrants. Right? But for people whose complaint is that immigrants are going to give us big government, actually seems like the story, at least the story is a lot more mixed than they think, and in fact, quite plausibly goes the other way. All right, so finally, so even if this complaint were true, once again, there's a cheaper and more humane way of dealing with the fact that immigrants will vote the wrong way. And this cheaper and more humane way is don't let them vote. Right? And in fact, there are plenty of countries that even have a legal term for people who are allowed to come to a country and work but can't vote. Guest workers. Right? So you let them in as a guest worker, you have a visa to work, you're allowed to participate in the economy, you pay taxes, but you just don't get to vote. Right? So if you really were worried about this would be another way of handling the same problem, which seems to deal with the actual complaint. All right. So Yes, the verdict. Here we have one of my favorite characters from The Simpsons, Nelson the bully. Let's see. And here he is making that classic bullies our excuse for punching you. So, you're breathing my air. And what did I ever do? You're breathing my air. Okay, which I think is the ultimate argument for immigration restrictions. All right, so let's go on the list. There's a list of standard arguments which fail to overcome the presumption against immigration restrictions. And again, I'm saying, look, immigration restrictions is a terrible thing to do to another human being. If there's a person, like, all I want to do is get on a boat, go to Florida, and shine shoes to make enough money to keep my children from starving, and you say no. Seems like you really ought to have a very good reason to tell a person like that no. I mean, this person is not saying, I want your charity. I want you to give me money. All he's saying is, leave me alone so that I can go and find some customers. That's all I'm asking for. And to go and say no to that seems like a minimum, it's something that should make you nervous. Something where you wouldn't want to do it unless you had some very good reasons. Right? And the reasons that have been put forward, even if there's something to them, they are not nearly as strong as most people assume. Okay? The problems that restrictions purport to solve are, at best, grossly exaggerated. In fact, many of the problems that people complain about, precisely the opposite is true. Immigration is actually good for American living standards, on average. Americans would be richer if we could let in a lot of immigrants to help us take care of our kids, to mow our lawns, to build more housing, to raise housing prices, to get our country out of our housing crisis. There's all kinds of things that immigrants do for us that make us better off. People focus on the small area of harm that's being done, rather than looking at the big picture. Right? So again, to say that there's any American at all who suffers, sure, like for any change at all, there's going to be some American who suffers. But do Americans in general lose from immigration economically? Doesn't look like they do. Do American taxpayers suffer? At least that's questionable. It's possible that American taxpayers are actually better off because immigrants are helping to pay taxes for a bunch of things where the total cost has very little to do with the population. All right. But in any case, so even if you want to go to the pessimistic end of the stories, right, so even if you think that immigrants are doing at least substantial harm to American high school dropouts, even if you think that they're a modest fiscal burden, still these problems are a lot less serious than people make out. But finally, even if you disagree, even if you think that everything that I've told you is wrong, there are some arguments that I told you that I think you can evaluate without leaving the room, right? Without actually even going on a computer. These are arguments saying, look, even no matter how severe the argument is, or how severe the problem is, there's a cheaper and more humane way of handling whatever your complaint is. There are better ways of doing it. We don't have to treat people the way that we do. There are cheaper and more humane ways of handling it. So there are certain, and I'll say this is certainly true. Right? It is certainly true that instead of telling immigrants they can't come here, we could charge them admission fees or higher taxes. It's certainly true that we could let them in and say they're not eligible for benefits. Certainly true that we could say you can come here if you can pass the test of English literacy, or you can pass the test of cultural literacy. Certainly true we could let them in and say you can't vote. Right? These are all other ways of handling the complaints that people have, which decisively solve the complaint without imposing the horrible suffering on immigrants that current policies do impose. Right, so again, entry fees, surtaxes, welfare eligibility requirements, fluency tests, cultural literacy tests, voting restrictions, and so on. All right, so I will stop here. Happy to take questions. Let me just see, how much time have we got left? All right. Okay, good. Got plenty of time. Okay, so let's start here.
I have actually two things to say.
Okay.
One, you mentioned South Park. There's actually a recent episode
Yes.
called Last of the Mexicans.
Yep.
Basically, everything you said is if all the Mexican immigrants went back to Mexico, where Warsaw started, and the Border Patrol is actually doing the opposite of what it does, trying to keep the Mexicans in instead of out.
Yes. It's another great South Park episode where the Border Patrol tries to keep Mexicans in to prevent them from ruining our country by leaving.
Second thing, my question is there any concern that these cultural literacy tests could turn into Jim Crow laws?
Sure, of course. But if you're in Haiti, you could either say, well, they could turn into Jim Crow laws, but what do you have instead? Right now, you got no chance of getting in at all. Yeah, so I mean, when I say there's a cheaper, more humane alternative, I'm not advocating it. I'm saying it's a lot better than what we've got.
So,
right? To have a law, to have a test where only 10% of Haitians getting in, it's a lot better than one where only maybe 0.1% can get in. And right now, unless you've got relatives in the U.S., it's almost impossible for a low-skilled Haitian to get into the U.S.
So the benefits are greater than the cost, and it wouldn't matter if the literacy tests are like Jim Crow laws.
Well, it would matter. It would matter. Saying the difference between saying that something is a lot better than what we got and saying it's good. All right, so look, if we were to go and let in, even 10% of Haitians, this would make the lives of about 1 million people way better. Right? In fact, a lot more than that, because if you let in 1 million Haitians, a lot of their money is going to go straight back to Haiti to go and take care of their desperate families. Right? So actually, it is totally plausible that just by letting in 1 million Haitians to work, you could go and eliminate most poverty in Haiti, just because almost everyone would have a relative or friend who is in the U.S. making so much money by Haitian standards that they could pay for them to at least get by. So is there a danger that cultural literacy tests can be used in this way? Sure. I personally do not favor cultural literacy test. I'm just saying that if this is your concern, fine, you can write the test and be better than what we got.
Okay.
Yes. Let's see. I think you had a question. Yes.
I had a few actually, but I'll try to keep them brief.
All right. Let's see. Or if you got a bunch, we could do one or two and then come back to you. That'd be fine too.
With regards to culture, how do you comment, or what was your comment to what's going on in France, for example? What's going on in terms of, are they actually advocating low welfare payments there? I mean, maybe, I don't know. What do you comment on that situation? I know, I'm from Vancouver, and I don't know if you know about Vancouver, there's a suburb called Richmond, and if you're going to Richmond, it doesn't seem like you're in Vancouver anymore. It's a very highly dense population of people from Hong Kong, and there's more Chinese lettering than there is. And not that there's anything wrong with that, but what would be your explanation for why those sorts of suburbs can be that? And then what incentive would there be for people living in those suburbs to learn English if, in a sense, it's like in their own self-contained bubble? What is that first kind of broader question on the culture?
Sure. All right, so what's going on in France? In France, they have both a big welfare state and they have a lot of labor market regulation, which makes it very difficult for someone to get a job. I don't know if you've heard about this, but basic point of labor economics. If you pass a law saying that it is illegal to fire people, this does not create jobs over the long run. Right? Because if you're an employer and you can never fire a person for any reason, you are very skeptical and cautious when you think about hiring a person in the first place. Best way of thinking about it is this. Suppose that you had to marry any person that you went out on one date with. How would this adjust your dating behavior? You'd be very cautious. You might want to hire a private investigator before you even consider going on a date with someone. You might want to have a bunch of friends go and talk to them. You might want to have them interviewed. You might want to have your parents meet them before you even date them yourself. So, well, if I actually talk to them, that could be construed as a date. That could end in marriage. Right? So in Europe, the results of immigration are noticeably less favorable because first, the welfare state is more generous, so it is more tempting not to work. But secondly, there's a lot more to the story, which is a lot of immigrants. It's very hard for them to get a job because employers in France and many other countries in Europe are reluctant to hire. Now, in terms of whether this is shrinking the welfare state, I think there is actually very good evidence for this. So, Scandinavia over the last 20 years has actually let in a lot of immigrants. Mostly Sweden the most, Denmark some. And finally, in these countries, for the first time in decades, people are complaining about the welfare state. So Danes are saying, there's all these Middle Eastern immigrants ripping us off. There were Danes ripping them off for decades, but they didn't care because they were Danes. And Danes would only do it for good reason. But when someone from the Middle East comes and goes on welfare, then they're doing it out of malice or laziness or whatever. So there have been cutbacks in the welfare states in Scandinavia, and it seems like the main argument that actually makes sense to people there is it's not fair because foreigners are coming and taking the money and ripping us off. And see, in terms of enclaves, so there have always been enclaves. Whenever immigrants have come to a country, it's been totally standard for them to have their own neighborhoods where they put out signs in their own original languages. The thing to remember is these are basically for first-generation immigrants. So first-generation immigrants are very likely to live in an enclave in a segregated neighborhood. And yes, it's true. First-generation immigrants often don't learn the language of the country they go to, but second-generation immigrants almost always do. Certainly in the United States. Okay, so again, it's like Chinese immigrants in Vancouver. It's almost unthinkable that they don't really want their kids to go and learn English so they can then become very successful in Canadian society, which is what Chinese immigrants around the world do. Is step one, show up and start some businesses. And step two, try to figure out a way to get their kids into into good schools and into good careers and to succeed in the society they've arrived in. So when you go and take a look at a whole lot of immigrants, they set up a new neighborhood. Generally the people who live in neighborhoods like that are first-generation immigrants and their kids. And what do they aspire to? They aspire to their kids learning English and then moving out to the suburbs, right? And coming back occasionally for the festivals or whatever. But yes. Well, I mean, short term isn't quite right because it's like very often like first-generation immigrants will live there their whole lives, right? But short term in the sense this doesn't mean that there's going to be a separate Chinese society developing inside of Canada, which again goes against like the patterns of Chinese immigration all over the world, which is to figure out a way to succeed. Right? So you can look at all over Asia there are Chinese minorities who succeed in business and do very well in these societies by mastering the culture of that society and being bicultural.
Okay, my second question, I appreciate that. Second question was, with respect to liberty, I envision people wouldn't necessarily have as much issue with the size of the welfare state and relatively spoken to that point. But what about this general faith for support for property rights? I mean, it seems to me a lot of people that are coming from these poorer countries don't have that same tradition and maybe desire for strength of property rights. And so, how would that necessarily,
Yeah, I mean, again, is there a slight tendency that way? Possibly. I mean, really, just the amount of research that's been done on it is so small, it's pretty hard to tell. Although, just the fact that it's the kind of thing you have to do some research even to get a decent answer on whether it's a serious problem. Main thing we'd say is the U.S. had virtually open borders for the whole 19th century and didn't seem to do anything to undermine property rights during the 19th century. Seemed like there was really no effect there. So, could there be some slight effect? There could be. Right? Just the main, so the main thing to think about is saying, look, so there's possibly some slight reduction in the strength of property rights in the United States, and in order to achieve this, we are going to deprive many millions of people in other countries of the most basic right to go and shine shoes in order to keep their kids from starving. Right? What's striking is when you compare the kinds of complaints that people have against the kinds of harms that they want to inflict on immigrants, it really is shocking. So I have a colleague who's very hostile to immigration, and often have complaints like there are signs written in 2 languages. It's very upsetting, and that's why people should not be allowed to leave Haiti. So on the one hand, you occasionally have to look for an extra millisecond to find the English version of what you want to read, and this is a good argument for why millions of people ought to starve in Haiti. It seems like a great overreaction to a minor inconvenience, right? And yet, so much of it just comes down to thinking that the slightest harm to Americans justifies inflicting any kind of injury on people in another country, at least as long as we don't let them in. Let's see. So yes, over there.
something you didn't cover was
Population control.
Were you, with an economy that's not creating enough jobs for the population that it's adding to, were you advocating an immigrant exchange, or were you always have a base that's moving in, one base that's moving in, another base of people that's moving out?
No, I was not, although that is, so there's an interesting idea that one of my colleagues likes to push. So the idea is you could sell your citizenship and then you could go and get some money from someone who wants to come here and you have to leave. But no, I was not suggesting that. So what I'd say is that population and unemployment fundamentally have nothing to do with each other. You can go and take a look at societies with large populations, with large increases in population, and they don't seem to on average have higher unemployment rates than countries with lower density or lower populations. You can even take a look at the massive entry of women in the labor force in the United States in the 60s and 70s and 80s. What happened to the unemployment rate? Pretty hard to see. So we added many tens of millions of additional workers, and yet the economy absorbs them. So just think about labor markets in terms of supply and demand. If there's a large increase in labor supply, the effect is that employers will figure out something else to do with the new people who've arrived. In terms of right now, there's high unemployment. I'd say one thing, I think it's just a bad idea to set policy on the basis of a temporary problem. Right? So it's a bad idea to set it on the basis of a temporary problem. Also, I think it is totally plausible that more immigration would actually be a solution to our unemployment problem. Certainly in terms of raising housing prices. There seems to be a pretty close connection between the recession and housing prices, as well as many of the policies the government's pursuing. Seems like one of the best ways to get things back on track would be to get housing prices to go back up. And one of the few things that we can actually think of that would drastically raise housing prices is just letting population increase. And so in general, if you read my book, Selfish Reasons to Have More Kids, I think that more people are a good thing. Right? And I think that we are underpopulated rather than overpopulated. When I was on the plane today, I looked out the window and saw many areas that really needed a lot of people and didn't have them. Areas where many huge numbers of people could live here and be happy, in contrast to the countries where they are, where they're starving and miserable. Right? And I say it's just sad that they aren't here. Right? We really could fit a vastly larger number of people here, no problem. Right? And of course, this has happened in the 19th century. There was a massive immigration. By the way, kind of interesting, you go and compare the U.S. and Australia. Australia had a much more restrictive immigration policy. So now they have about maybe like 10% the population of the U.S. and about the same land area. Right? What if they had the immigration rates the United States had? Right? Australia could be as large an economy as the United States. Right? It could be as interesting a place to be. Nothing against Australia, but there's not nearly as much going on there as in a country with larger population. Yes, over there. Yes, you.
It's actually a question that my father, or a protest my father, as well as a couple friends, have raised against immigration. And something that you mentioned a minute ago about the Haitians and sending that money back to Haiti.
Mm-hmm.
Something that my dad has often said is that immigrants who make money here,
Mm-hmm.
by sending it overseas, are stealing American, like taking money through there.
Mm-hmm. Right. So since a lot of you are in macroeconomics, there's a very simple, if that really were the problem, there'd be a simple solution, and that's just to print more money. Right? And basically, this would mean that we are getting free stuff in exchange for pieces. We're getting stuff in exchange for pieces of paper, right? Which we can print in unlimited amounts. However, again, that is only against the simplest version. The reality is, what do Haitians do when they get cash? When they get cash from their relatives in the United States, they to some extent they go and buy it on products in Haiti, but mostly they go and import stuff that isn't made in Haiti, like food. Right? They need food, and it's pretty hard to grow more in Haiti, so they wind up importing stuff, and for the most part they wind up getting it from the United States. Or of course, if they don't get it from the United States, they go and buy it from another country with dollars, and the people in that country get the dollars. Then they eventually buy it from the United States. So basic international trade is either the money goes out and never comes back, which is the best case of all, because we can just print up some more money and we get stuff for free. We get stuff for pieces of paper, right, which we can print up in unlimited quantities. Or in reality, what generally happens is that the money that goes overseas, someone goes and takes it and spends it on something that either is made in the U.S. or they spend it on something in another country. That person gets the money, and then they eventually spend on someone in the U.S. Right? Added complications, exchange rates. So if there really is a lot of money that is leaving the country, I'm not going to get into exchange rates; too complicated. But so international trade class, there's basically exchange rates are a further mechanism that makes sure this isn't really any kind of a serious problem, because if people are buying very little of our stuff and we're buying a lot of their stuff, the end result is that the dollar becomes cheaper until people want to buy more of our stuff and we don't want to buy so much of their stuff. Let's see, it's way in the back.
I have a couple questions.
Mm-hmm.
First, in regards to the language issues.
Mm-hmm.
I personally don't have a problem seeing a sign in multiple languages.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody in the store or a car or something, and they don't understand a word I'm saying.
Mm-hmm.
It's not the official, but the language spoken.
Mm-hmm.
And you say that, well, 90% of second generation will speak English. Doesn't that include the immigrants themselves? That's the issue.
Hmm.
In that you're saying that the immigrants that come here, all of their children will speak English.
Mm-hmm.
They still don't.
Mm-hmm. Right. I can see how that could be a very minor inconvenience for you. I don't see what the big deal is. How often is your day ruined by the fact that you meet a first-generation immigrant who can't speak English? Again, I would say is very often the reason why you're dealing with them at all is because they're working for you or you're a customer, and they are actually giving you a better deal than any American that you were dealing with would have been doing. So, if they're working here as a gardener or a cleaning lady, to say, look, I'm upset because you don't speak English. On the other hand, I'm glad that you're here because you give me a better deal than an American. I could go and hire an American who speaks fluent English to do the same job, but I don't want to because it's too expensive. Yeah. And you say you had another question?
Yeah, the other question is, I'm hearing a lot about when we turn somebody away that wants to immigrate here,
Mm-hmm.
we are subjecting them to the horrors of their own.
Mm-hmm.
Is it just out of curiosity, is it our personal responsibility to help all these people? Are we somehow the welfare of the world?
That's a great question. So I said there's a very big difference between saying that Americans have an obligation to give free money to people all over the world and saying that Americans have an obligation not to prevent them from getting a job from a willing American employer and buying stuff from a store that's happy to deal with them. What immigrants are asking for is not a handout. They're asking to come here and do a hard, low-skilled job, in exchange for money from a willing employer, right? And when they go to a store, like the store, so the employer wants them there, the store wants them there, the landlord wants them there. So again, it's a very big difference between saying that we have a charitable obligation, which I'm not convinced we do, versus saying we have an obligation to leave them alone to go and trade the skills they have with people who are interested in dealing with them. Right? So when you think about, people often think about immigrants as being trespassers. Like, who are they trespassing on? They're not trespassing on the property of the employers who want to hire them. They're not trespassing in the apartments of the landlords who want to rent to them. They're not trespassing in the stores of merchants who want to deal with them. So exactly whose property rights are they really violating? So it's tempting for people to go and conceive it as some kind of charity. To say it's not charity. It's just a matter of respecting the same rights that we respect from anyone else. Any stranger says, look, you don't owe me, but this doesn't mean that you can go and prevent me from going and taking a job that you might have wanted yourself, right? Or going to a grocery store and saying, what are you doing here? Well, I have the permission of the owner, just like you. Yes, right there.
I had a question about your thought experiment that kind of opened up the presentation. It seems like someone who opposes immigration might say, is there a distinction to be made between someone who's from Haiti, who's a Haitian citizen, and someone who travels to the U.S. to Haiti and just wants to come back who's an American citizen? I mean, isn't that kind of an obvious distinction?
Well, what I'm saying is, all right, so why does that make a difference? Right? So, if there's a person who's born in this country and says, I want to come here, well, why not? Right? And seems like there should be a good reason. And I'm saying, same thing goes for someone who wasn't born in this country. Say, look, I want to come here and find a job. You say, no, well, why not? Right? So, the idea of the thought experiment is this. Either way, there ought to be some decent reason that is being given for why a person can't do it. Right? And whether or not you're born in the country still seems like either way, it is such a horrible harm to inflict on a person. At least to do it for no reason at all. It seems like very, very harsh and cruel.
Because once again, I think I pretty much agree with you, but I think this is what someone would say. Let's say someone owns two houses, and someone moves into the second house and squats it. They're not living in the other house, the person owns two houses, but someone moves into the second house and squats it. And they say, you have to give me a good reason I should leave. You're not using this house. Why can't I use it?
How about, I work hard for that house, and I'm planning on renting it to someone else, or I'm going to use it for a relative. Here's the thing, look, I actually created that house. That seems like a pretty good reason. But in the case of the U.S., it's not, it's not that immigrants are asking to go and move into vacant houses in the U.S. without their owner's permission. They're asking permission to go, and they want to come in here and move in with the owner's permission. And the law says that even if the owner of the real estate wants to let them in and the immigrant wants to come here, it's still illegal.
I think this is the last question.
Okay, sure.
As for the argument that immigrants come in and they don't have a strong, belief in liberty and property rights, wouldn't the history of America the past century and a half or so suggest that Native Americans, American citizens, have done more to degrade individual liberty and property rights than?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Yeah, so when people talk about foreigners not loving liberty, well, if you talk to Americans, Americans love liberty? Not that I've noticed that much. Again, there may be some marginal difference, but people often frame it as, right now we have this great libertarian paradise, and we're going to let some foreigners are going to ruin it. It's like, look, maybe they'll make it a little bit worse, but it's certainly not moving from libertopia to socialism by letting them in. Maybe there'll be a 1 percentage point move in a bad direction, ignoring, of course, the immigration itself. Right? Here's something that on the general point. When people think about the overall quality of policy and how free the American economy is, the labor market is 70% of the economy. Right? 70% of income comes from labor. So when you have very strict regulations on the labor market, this isn't just one other market where you happen to have some regulations. This is regulating the biggest market in the country. It's regulating the most important market. So I'd say if you have two countries, one has open immigration and a lot of other kinds of regulation, that economy is probably a lot freer overall than another economy where you have very strict immigration restrictions, but the rest of the economy is not regulated. Why? Because immigration restrictions are themselves not just a regulation, they are a very strict regulation that is imposed upon the most important market in the entire economy. Right? And again, just to get an idea, like how strict are the regulation or immigration restrictions? My dad often says that we all have open borders already. Right? Saying something. If we had open borders already, would people pay $4,000 to sneak across the border? I don't think so. Like for agricultural workers, that can be 1 or 2 years' income. Do you pay